It goes without saying that Connecticut is a different place than it was 100 years ago. Gone are the days of industry with smokestacks spewing coal black smoke into the air. Factories have closed down and the old way of doing things has gone. But the memories are still in the landscape of our towns and cities. The story is in the soil waiting for someone to tell it. Christopher Kervick, former first selectman of Windsor Locks, made it a life's passion to tell the story of the Windsor Locks Canal and give voice to the untold masses who toiled from dawn to dusk in often lethal conditions to forge a better life. He joins us today on the Municipal Voice to tell their story. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into talking about your book, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a Windsor Locks, Connecticut guy, born and bred, and went to Windsor Locks High School, went off to college, went off to law school, then turned around and came back home to Windsor Locks and started my law practice. And I've been practicing law for just shy of, I think it's 38 years now. But along the course of that, I had a couple of exits. I served as a probate judge, Connecticut judge of probate.
Okay.
That was a great job. It was part-time in Windsor Locks.
Mm-hmm.
You may recall several years ago, I certainly recall from my meetings at CCM, the process of the probate court consolidation, which was a tough process. And the little towns really got hurt, and Windsor Locks' probate court was consolidated out of existence.
Yeah.
So ended that good part-time gig for me. But after that, probably because the powers that be in Windsor Locks saw that I turned out to be a pretty good vote-getter for a probate judge. So they said, our first selectman is retiring. Would you be interested in? I hadn't thought about that, although I did feel very strongly about some of the efforts to upgrade Main Street, and we had one of these old post-industrial main streets that had kind of seen better days. And it was a real effort with partnering with the state and CCM, for that matter, to upgrade it. So I thought about it, and I told them that I'd be interested in doing so if they let me focus primarily on Main Street, because that was my number one thing. That was my old paper route, that area. So I had a vested interest. So I won, and I ended up serving 3 terms, and we made a great deal of progress. Matter of fact, we were the first municipality in the state of Connecticut to establish a tax increment financing district in support of our Main Street efforts.
And how far back was that?
That would have been 2000. I was first elected in 15. I think it was in 2017.
Okay.
We were able to get that, convince enough people in town as to the benefits of it, do the legwork, do the preliminary work to get it done. And it was successful because shortly thereafter, the old Montgomery Mill, which I write about extensively in the book, had been abandoned for 35 years. And a developer out of Boston, Beacon Communities, came in and they converted it to first-class apartments. And the number one reason they did it, what set you apart from other communities, was the tax increment financing district, because of the benefits it offered to them. There were some gaps in financing, as there often is that type of project. But by the use of the tax increment financing ordinance that we passed, we were able to figure out ways to bridge that gap and make the project viable for them. So it was a real success story, and we were making a lot of progress along those lines. So I served 3 terms.
Excellent.
After that, then I had to decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to go back full time into the practice of law? Because most of my clients had gone elsewhere, because late meetings at First Selectman, I mean, it was a lot more hours than I expected. And their lives don't stop, so they weren't about to wait for me. And so I decided I really didn't want to retool back up to where I was. I still practice, but I'm very selective about the type of cases that I take now. And then we had coincidentally had picked up sort of a fixer-upper property in New London, Connecticut. And was my, one of my diversions on the weekend was to go down there and fix it up.
Yeah.
And so about the same time that happened, I did work briefly in the Bronin administration
Hmm.
in Hartford and economic development for them. But when his when he chose not to run for reelection, that was kind of the writing on the wall for me.
Yeah.
So we moved to full time to New London into the now fixed up property down there. And one of the drivers behind that was that I my house is within walking distance, like a block away from Mitchell College, and
Oh, very nice.
I approached them about teaching as an adjunct, teaching a local history course, which had been my passion.
Yeah.
And they liked the idea, and one thing led to another, and I'm finishing up my third year doing that. It's been a very successful course. My young students have gotten articles published in the New London Day and things of that nature. So it's been
Mhm.
really rewarding. And I think long term, uh, that's my soft landing
Yeah.
is that adjunct position and continuing to do projects like this that led to this,
Keep you
led to
busy.
keep me busy.
Definitely.
That's kind of where,
Yeah.
where I am, kind of how I got here. But then again, it took me 22 years to get this
Yeah.
book.
Well,
So
yeah, yeah. You were heavily involved in the recent history of Windsor and everything, but you were interested in the farther back stuff. So,
yes.
talking about your book, The Windsor Locks Canal, Yankee Enterprise, and Irish Muscle, it takes place right in your hometown where you're first selectman of Windsor Locks, which is, I believe, one of the oldest towns in Connecticut, isn't that right?
Well, it broke off from Windsor
Okay.
basically
Yeah.
because of the canal, because of the when the canal came in. See, the canal was used both for transportation and water power,
Hmm.
and as the water power and industrial aspect of it continued to grow, uh, there was wealth that came along with that, and the
Hmm.
Windsor Locks folks, uh, they weren't at all interested in having that wealth shared with Windsor, and they also, with the rise of the Irish population
Hmm.
became a concurrent rise of the Democratic population, and they realized that, hey, if we kind of split off here, we could really get some political security
Hmm.
for our emerging Democratic Party. And they did. Windsor Locks placed the first Irish Catholic legislature in the Connecticut and the Connecticut legislature, and it was a Democratic stronghold
Yeah.
for years and years and years.
So, the canal itself has kind of been like a lifelong kind of passion, the history of it and the town, which are very much interwoven. How did you first start learning about this story? Like, did you walk past the remains
Yeah.
of the canal every day when you were a kid?
Well, I lived Elm Street is the kind of the main drag east to west in Windsor Locks,
Hmm.
and I lived second or third house up the hill on Elm Street. So I've calculated it's about 300 yards from the canal. So it
Okay.
was always a very big part of my life, even as a, boy playing in the neighborhood and, going in the streams and that type of thing. So I was always familiar with it. My grandfather was a truck driver. He was
Hmm.
a solo truck driver, and he chose to live in Windsor Locks in 1925 because his route was Springfield to Hartford. So he picked halfway. There's even a
Yeah.
town in Windsor Locks called Halfway House Road, and it's not a road based on people in recovery. It's because it was halfway between Hartford and Springfield. So my grandfather chose Windsor Locks, and my family's been here ever since. So it was always there. And my grandfather, of Irish descent, he would just say to me, in my many times, I was the youngest brother, so I had to
Hmm.
go there a lot to rake leaves and shovel snow and do all that stuff. But um, the Irish dug that canal. He always said, the Irish dug that canal.
Yeah.
Not a lot more than that, but that was always the message that was conveyed to me. So I always kind of had that lingering in the back of my head. But then it wasn't until that I really dove in. It wasn't until I think it was early 1990s. And as an attorney, I do a lot of title searches. I did a lot of real estate
Hmm.
work. So the state of Connecticut was hiring me for different projects, and they hired me to do a title search of the towpath of the canal because the state was in
Oh,
the
yeah.
process. They were leasing it, and it's now one of the state's best walking trails. Beautiful because it's
Hmm.
the combination of the canal and the river and the wildlife. It's just gorgeous. The eagles, nest there. So that was an early in that process. So they had me do a title search. Well, that was a big title search. It took me a
Yeah.
while. but in the course of that, well, two things happened. One, I just got more and more interested in, how did this get here? And I started seeing little bits and pieces of things that gave me a clue to that in the course of the title search. But also, one of the things I did was where I reviewed in the title search. There was this guy Michael Raber and Malone, also hired by the state. They were thinking about doing a canal um, uh, history center, and they were
Okay.
thinking about locating it there. So they did a historical survey of the canal, and
Hmm.
it was a great job. They did a tremendous job. But one thing they said was that 400 nameless Irish workers built the canal.
Hmm.
Being stubborn, I said, nameless? I don't like
Yeah.
that word nameless.
They
They're
had
not
names.
nameless.
Yeah.
We don't know their names. Just when I have free time, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out the name of one of those guys.
Yeah.
And that's really what started it. Luckily, succeeded in that goal, and maybe 80 times over. We know the name of a lot of the workers now,
Hmm.
and we also learned where some of them came from.
Now, how did you track that kind of stuff down? Was it through like
Well,
family records or like was there a company that built the thing that had like employee records sort of stuff?
so there was several different sources, but one initial source, because the canal straddles the Windsor Locks. Well, then it was just Windsor
Hmm.
Suffield line, and a couple laborers I was able to determine were buried in the Old Center Cemetery in Suffield.
Hmm.
And in both cases, it was a later relative came over and placed a gravestone on the site.
Okay.
Well, one of them, for example, was Michael Costello. Well, they spelled it. No one knew how to spell then.
Yeah.
Most of them were, unfortunately, there was no education available for Catholics in Ireland, so they were illiterate. But it was spelled Costello, Costlo.
Hmm.
But it said of Kilfinane, Limerick, Ireland. And so I said, nah, I have a really got a good clue about where this
Where to
fellow
start
was
looking? Yeah.
from. So the canal was constructed between, generally we say 1827, 1829.
Hmm.
But that was sort of the ceremonial opening. It wasn't really done in 1829.
Okay.
They just had a lot of pressure on them to have an opening.
Like a
So
section was open or something?
yeah, so in November as the season ended in 1829, they had this big ceremonial opening, and they could get a boat up and down it, but there was more work to be done, and
Hmm.
so some contractors remained, and then even after that, the canal company itself hired some of the individual Irish laborers, and they were taken on as laborers or to fix leaks and
Hmm.
troubleshooters, and watchmen, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So now I had Costello out of Kilfinane, Ireland. So where was my next trip? Kilfinane,
Good.
Ireland.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I do, and then there was a couple other instances where I was able to trace where the laborers came from in Ireland.
Hmm.
So one of the things that I try and do in the book is I bring the reader back to those spots, or all that we know about those spots, and what were the conditions in Ireland like at that time or in their youth
That
that would
made
have led them
going
to
across the
immigrate.
ocean to dig a
Yeah,
canal
because this
a
is
good dock.
pre-famine.
Yeah.
This is pre-famine immigration.
Mm.
Famine immigration is 1845, 1855, but this is 1825.
Yeah. It's not
So
that
this
big
was an
rush.
earlier wave.
It's a trickle starting. Yeah.
Right. And so what were the conditions then? And
Hmm.
really it was labor unrest. It
Yeah.
was, all the land had been given to English landlords who had been, served in when Oliver Cromwell conquered Ireland, and they were all the land that was owned by Irish people was taken back by the king and then redistributed to Cromwellian soldiers or other people who
Yeah.
had, met with the favor of the king. So there was a lot of tension between landlords and peasant, at the time.
Yeah.
Kilfinane, Ireland was one particular one where it was a real hot spot. Yeah. So for that generation, there was no opportunity. There was no opportunity because the way the land was divided was based on a system that kept splitting the land, splitting the land, splitting land. It used to be the oldest son would inherit, so the farm would stay intact.
Yeah.
But now they kept splitting it and splitting it and splitting it.
So every
And
generation
they
had a
have
smaller piece. Yeah.
yeah, they had a plot of land that wasn't enough to sustain their own family. So people had to go. There was,
Yeah.
I mean, the famine took care of that to some extent because a lot of them died in the famine. But leading up to that was where the real pressure point was. So I
Yeah.
talk a lot about that because I try and set that off against what's happening here.
Hmm.
Why did these Irishmen show up here, and why were they so available to do the work that no one else was willing to do.
Yeah. So you're talking 1820. So this is pre steam engines. This is all being dug by
Well,
hand.
no,
This
the
is
steam engines had just come out, but
okay.
so Robert Fulton, who is not he's not the inventor of the steam engine, but he's the one that sort of brought it into
Figured out how
um,
to bring it to market. Yeah.
to bring it to market. He had a monopoly on it, and New York waters, and it was tricky. But those were larger steamboats. The canal, see, at the same time that Windsor Locks Canal was developed,
Hmm.
it was in response to New Haven. The Erie Canal had just come in, and everyone realized that this was going to be the big new technology and how
Yeah.
transportation was done. So Farmington, including James Hillhouse and all the big guys in Farmington, they say, "Hey, let's do our own canal." Because
Hmm.
New Haven doesn't have they don't have any inland transportation much beyond the harbor. So
Okay.
they said, let's build an overland canal from New Haven all the way to Northampton, Mass on the Connecticut River. And we will then bypass Middletown, Hartford, and Springfield. And we'll have this direct inland route, and then we'll be on the hub. We'll be at the point of that, and we'll become very prominent because this is where all the
So
commerce is.
previously, New Haven, Harvard Springfield were the spots, and they're like, we're gonna skip over that and have our own special.
Right. They're going to
Okay.
have their own special. So the rich guys in Hartford, the merchants who previously were enjoying the benefit of the commerce going up the river,
Hmm.
they kind of panicked. They said, "Oh, we're in trouble." Prior to that, see, everything was smooth until they got to Windsor Locks, but then there was a 5 mile stretch of rapids,
Hmm.
and the sloops couldn't get by that. So they used to have to offload the goods into warehouses in Warehouse Point. That's how it got its name.
Okay.
Transport it by mule team overland up to Springfield, put it back on boats, and then go farther north up to northern Mass and Vermont.
Hmm.
And that was fine when there was no other alternative because it was expensive. You had to pay these guys to pole it up over the falls or to cart it over land. But then when New Haven offered this alternative,
Yeah.
Harper guy said, "Oh no, now we got to do something." So that's when they came up to the plan to not only build this canal, but to buy up 5 other existing canals that were already up in Massachusetts and Vermont
Hmm.
and tie it all together in one enterprise. They never really pulled off the full plan of getting all those canals.
Yeah.
Massachusetts would not play ball with that. But the Windsor Lock Canal was the first big project that came of it, and that's why the canal is here. It was in competition. It was in fear that New
Hmm.
Haven was going to pass them by.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
The
Yeah.
rivalry between Hartford and New Haven, which was always strong,
Yeah.
it exploded at that point. I mean, they were just every week they were blasting each other in the New Haven Register, the Hartford Times, the Hartford Current, the editorial pages. They were just, that scheme's no good. And that thing.
Yeah.
And then when they started building the canal and they had a little setback, they had a
Hmm.
cave in or something. The New Haven papers would report the Hartford plan had a major setback. It'll set them back years before they'll be able to
And it's like
go.
this big competition sort of
Yeah.
thing,
And the
basically.
Harper
Yeah.
guy's like, "Oh, we had this little mishap, but we'll be back on track in a week." But meanwhile, New Haven, with that last rainfall that they got, the walls caved in, and
It almost reminds me of the tracks coming from the west and the east trying to meet up in the middle, and
yeah,
who can lay more track in a day, sort of thing.
and the reason for that is that these were private enterprises. Well, one of the
Yeah.
reasons the state we didn't have enough laborers on our own to hire,
Hmm.
and we didn't really have what they used to do was like they needed a road, they would just pass a law that says everyone who lives along this road, you guys to make this road. And
Hmm.
then every year you got to pay us a tax so we can hire you to fix this road. No
Yeah.
one like that. Then they started organizing private companies, like toll companies.
Hmm.
So we'll
Okay.
give you the enterprise, we'll pass it and let you form a company and sell stock to build this road from Suffield to Windsor Locks. Um, and you can charge a toll and you can pay, once you receive up to 8% or whatever
Yeah.
on your investment, then it might become public, but it never really did because they never really made much money. So that's how public works got done back then.
Yeah.
Now the Erie Canal came and they used the contractor system, just like we use to build highways.
Hmm.
today. They hire contractors and they do a section and another and that was the way they had there. So they were in competition not just for the profits that would come from the tolls on the property, but they're in competition for laborers.
Hmm.
They were in competition with shippers as to which route they would choose. So it was naturally fierce. It
Yeah,
was
the
naturally
best
fierce.
engineers, whatever. And were they experienced with this before that here, or were they bringing in people from like the UK for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, that was the other problem. They didn't have any engineers.
Okay.
America really didn't have an established civil engineering system at that point.
Hmm.
So luckily, the Erie was kind of cutting ground. The Erie didn't know what to do. The Erie didn't. They didn't have engineers. They picked this really core of bright young guys. I
Hmm.
say guys because then it was all guys. And then one of them, a guy by the name of Canvas White, young man, early 20s, they sent him to England for a year to
Hmm.
take a notepad, travel the English canal system, and steal every technology, learn about every
Yeah.
technology that they have and every tool that they use to establish that. Learn everything you can, and then bring it back here so we can finish the Erie Canal.
Hmm.
And he did. And this young core, really amazing because they didn't have the skills. All they had was brains and enthusiasm. They finished the Erie Canal,
Yeah.
and with the technology that they had basically imported, and when they couldn't import it, they made it up. But it worked. So those guys then became, because once the Erie came in, then
Mhm.
everyone wanted to have a canal.
Yeah.
Then it was a boom. They saw how successful it was going to be. So these young engineers then started being hired. Oh, you're a canal expert? Oh, good. We have this project going on at Delaware
Hmm.
and Raritan Canal in New Jersey. Would you come work for us? So we hired, of all people, Canvas White was the one we hired. That very individual,
Yeah.
and he was the chief engineer of the Enfield Falls Canal. Now we know it as the Windsor Locks Canal.
Yeah.
So that's where we got the engineering.
So you talk about these private companies doing this. Did they end up actually making money off of this, or did they kind of get screwed up by the trains coming in? Because I know that kind of
Yeah,
the new technology came around they didn't see coming
it's a
necessarily.
great question. They actually looked at trains. Trains were already a thing when the canal was built,
Hmm.
and they did, an analysis. And the
Yeah.
analysis said, yeah, we don't think that's going to go anywhere, the
Yeah.
train thing. So we think we're safe. They miscalculated that. Um, so the heyday was only about 15 years.
Yeah.
1844, the train came in, and it kind of quickly eclipsed the canal's full utility. However, it's often been, it's seen as a bright line. Well, 1844, the train came in, that was the end of the canal, and that
Hmm.
was all trains. But that's not really true. There was a real gradual shift. Heavy freight was still coming by canal.
Yeah.
Hazardville, where the Hazard Powder Company is, a lot of the powder in the Civil War came from the Hazardville, Enfield, Connecticut.
Hmm.
Uh, that was considered too dangerous to ship on trains.
Mm.
Jostling around, sparks flying
Sparks
everywhere.
coming off of the engine. Yeah.
All that came through the canal. And that was 20 years after the train came in.
Hmm.
So even in 1900, there's at the Thomas Dodd Archives at UConn, they have the lock tenders logs,
Hmm.
and you can check the log, and he records everything that came through. At that point, it wasn't as much, like 1900 is one I recall, and it was more pleasure craft. A lot
Hmm.
of people north of Windsor Locks spent their summers with their sailboats down at Long Island Sound, so
Hmm.
they would bring their boat down through the canal, and so because they couldn't get past the rapids with their
Yeah.
sailboat. But there was still, even then, still some
So when
commercial.
did the canal stop like commercial traffic?
When did it completely stop?
Yeah.
I would say um, one of the historians who was Locks mentions coal coming to him by canal in the late 1880s. I can't recall.
Hmm.
1888 is coming to my mind. I think that was then there was some tariff changes or something along the
Hmm.
should mention tariffs. There was some changes in fees that came along around then that really didn't make it as economically viable to continue
Hmm.
to ship by the canal. So then it really shifted to commercial traffic. But there was traffic on the canal through the early part of the 1900s. I remember, and I talk about it in the canal. well, I don't say how old I am, but I remember as a boy, it was in the 70s,
Hmm.
and this kid came running up the hill toward my house as a neighbor. There's a boat in the canal. There's a boat in the canal. And all the kids, we were playing football or whatever, we ran down the hill, and there was a boat making its way through the canal. That was the early, maybe
Hmm.
74, some
So
75.
are there still sections that you can go through like on a kayak or something?
Well, no, because the canal itself has always been privately owned.
Okay.
And so it's now owned by it was the Connecticut River Company, and then
Hmm.
but ultimately that their interest of the canal got bought out to the last mill that still is on the canal, which
Hmm.
was the C.H. Dexter Paper Company. Now that's called the Alstrom Company. But it's still operating and making paper to this day. They own the whole canal because even though they don't use water power from the canal per se, they
Hmm.
use water from the canal in their
Paper making.
manufacturing process, and they need to keep the water flowing.
Yeah,
So
and Kimberly Clark down in New Milford is on the Housatonic like that too. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's the same thing. It's tricky because I'd love to see more preservation,
Hmm.
but because it's one of the few canals from the area that's still what they call in water.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of historical significance to it. I hosted a group from the Canal Society of New Jersey came up to look at the canal a few years back. There's a lot of nationwide interest in the canal because
Yeah.
you can see in Windsor Locks what people can only read about in other canal communities because the canals are no longer intact or in water.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I'm down in New Haven, and there's sections of the Farmington River Canal going through downtown, but unless you know the history of it, you wouldn't even necessarily recognize it because it's just
yeah,
stuck between a building here or there.
yeah. So it is from a historic preservation point of view, it's a real gem.
Yeah,
And preservation of the existing canal is something, but you can't get in a boat and go down there because it's privately owned and there are liability concerns.
got it.
However, the Dexter Alstrom Company, they were still very accommodating in
Hmm.
opening up the towpath to people there for recreational purposes, and that you can see. So you can walk the entire length of the canal, and
Really, it
it's
goes through it, just not supposed to go off into the rest of it.
right, right. It's about a 5.5 mile stretch, a walk, or bicycles or
Hmm.
walking, and it's heavily used, heavily
Yeah,
used.
and the
I remember I
towpath,
was
that's
in
where
office,
the horses would be that would like pull the barges. Is that the idea?
right, because when one of the ways that they responded to the threat from New Haven, they said, "Well, we got to." I remember this term from an advertising class I took in college. USP, unique selling principle.
Hmm.
We have to do something with our canal that sets us apart from New Haven. So what they did is they said, we're not just going to use donkeys and mules and horses to tow boats through the canal. We're going to develop a fleet of steam tugboats that pull, barges loaded with goods through the canal. The only
Okay.
problem was those boats didn't exist yet.
No one invented that thing yet. Yeah.
At least that's small enough.
Hmm.
And they not only did they not have the steamboats that small, but they were worried that the wash from the steamboats was going to wash out the banks of the canal.
Hmm.
So they did two things. They hired the best engineers out there or mechanics who hadn't worked on this, but this fellow like Thomas Blanchard, who was a great inventor from Springfield, he developed towboats small enough to fit through the locks of the canal. But they also lined the banks of the canal with stone
Hmm.
so that there wouldn't be it wouldn't wash away. And that's one of the main reasons the canal is still in water is because they took this extra precaution to keep it sturdy so
Really
that
sturdily built. Yeah.
so that's what set it apart from New Haven, and it worked because New Haven didn't last very long, and they had
Yeah.
problems. They sometimes in New Haven they had of course a longer route, but they went right through farmers' fields. Like they cut farmers' fields in half.
Yeah.
And these Yankee farmers, they're not going to just say, "Oh, that's cool, no
And
problem."
that's fine by
They
me.
would go,
Yeah.
they dig all day, and then they go back at night, and they found out the farmers had caved in all the work that they had done the day before
Yeah.
because they were so mad that their fields got cut. So they had a lot of problems with cave-ins. They even after the canal was open because they weren't lined with stone, they would
Hmm.
cave in a lot. So the Windsor Locks Canal was more sturdy, a much shorter distance, much easier to do.
Yeah.
So it was more successful than New Haven. New Haven is eventually they just covered it over and put the canal line railroad tracks there when that
Along
technology
it.
was
Yeah.
available.
Well,
Yeah.
because most of the canal things, in the Northeast that I come across have been converted to rail trails and stuff like that
Yeah.
because they're flat and they're straight, but there's not any water in them anymore.
So what they did when the train came through in Windsor Locks, they ran it parallel alongside of the canal, just far enough away that it
Mm.
wouldn't damage the canal. But that in and of itself led to an interesting discovery because what we found, and there was the Connecticut River Company, I think there was 14 individual parcels along the canal that they conveyed to
Mm.
the Hartford and Springfield Railroad Company. But there was one small parcel, about 70 feet by 70 feet on each side of what would be
Mm.
the center line of the tracks. And they said, and this was right next to where the laborer camp was, where the laborers lived during the day. And they said, oh, and as to this piece and this piece only, that we're including a restrictive covenant. Don't dig any deeper than is necessary to lay the railroad tracks. There's
Okay.
only the spot. And so that's our theory, is that the laborers who died during construction that
Graveyard.
weren't buried in Suffield were buried on this very well-defined site along the banks of the canal.
And do you think those are some of the unnamed Irish workers that we were talking about before?
Yes. Yeah, very yeah. I mean, in some projects, people exaggerate, I suppose, but some projects the statistics are that a worker died for every 50 feet of canal completed.
Yeah.
If you do 100 times that, not 10 times, 100 times that, you still would have had at least 50 worker deaths in the five and a
Yeah.
half mile stretch of the Windsor Locks Canal. So where are they? The 3 or 4 we found in Suffield, where are the rest of them? They had to be buried somewhere. And this
Yeah.
restricted covenant is plus other evidence that surrounds it seems pretty clear that this is the site
Yeah.
where they are buried.
Yeah. And
And
then because they were working with like shovels, picks, and what maybe black powder were they blasting with at that point?
yeah, they didn't have dynamite yet. So
Yeah.
what they did is they would spend all day with an iron pike just digging a hole into the rock, go as
Yeah.
deep as they could. They pack it with black powder. They had these rudimentary fuses,
Yeah.
uh, not a manufactured fuse, something that they
Yeah.
made. And then they would blast and run like heck.
Let it run like heck. Yeah.
And you were paid blasting was a skill that you were paid a little bit more for, So
Dangerous duty. Yeah.
they all claim to have expertise in blasting.
Yeah.
Sometimes the rocks, when they're like a half mile away, a guy would lose half his head
Yeah.
because this stuff was just flying everywhere, and there was a lot of blasting that needed to take place over this short stretch. Then disease was the other thing.
Yeah.
Disease was not particularly in the Windsor Locks Canal, but cholera was huge,
Mhm.
and there was one of the New Orleans canals or the Ohio Canal, and it said 4,000 mixed. They swung their picks to dig the big canal,
Yeah.
but the cholera was stronger than they, and twice it killed them all. So twice cholera wiped out the entire workforce and just brought in
Yeah.
more workers. So it was
Wild
brutal.
stuff.
Yeah. So I said I got to name some of these guys.
Yeah.
That's what I've been doing. Aside from trying to learn everything I can about the canal, and I'm happy to say that I have been able to name some, and I've even been able to identify a few that stayed in Windsor Locks and raised their family there after.
Mm.
These are the ones that were hired on by the canal company to
Yeah.
do
So the ones
auction
that
work.
didn't die there, they lived, they
Yeah,
made it through and lived
yeah,
the dream. They
yeah.
succeeded.
New York was like the way station. Like all the canals went to
Mhm.
New York and waited for work. And the
Mhm.
contractors would come down and say, "Look, I need 40 guys for this project in New Jersey or Connecticut, wherever." And then they'd pick up 40 and go. And then when that was done, unless the contractor immediately had work from somewhere else, they'd go back to New York and they'd wait for the next contractor to show up. So with very few exceptions, they all moved on after.
Yeah.
But like I said, I've been able to find 6 or 8 that remained here after,
Mhm.
and I read about them and all the genealogy work that I've been able
Are
to
there still
do.
some people in town today that are descended?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good question. I think there are, but there's a little gap on one that I'm trying to prove. Uh, but I've been
Rumor
able
has
to
it.
trace them. I've been able to trace them. I've reached out to some. Haven't had so much luck with tracking people, but I do have a list.
Mm.
Even though I wrote the book, it's only been
Yeah.
22 years, so I still got, I got plenty of time to continue. I have a list of people that I need to contact still and
Mhm.
try and see if I can convince them to, this day and age, you get a call on the phone or an email from somebody you never heard of, you probably just delete
Think
it
it's a scam.
and
Yeah.
move on, right? So that process wasn't as, I had all this enthusiasm, but I don't think they had that much enthusiasm. But that process is ongoing of trying to
So
identify.
it, in that process of trying to identify these people, through part of that, you were first selectman. How did you try to honor some of these people when you did rediscover their names?
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things that it was nice that when I was elected as first selectman, I was able to have a little bit more influence over the matter to try and right what I thought it was a historical wrong that these people were not just forgotten, but they were ignored.
Mhm.
They were ignored. Um, I linked up finally. For years, I tried to think, even before I was selectman, trying to figure out how we could get some sort of memorial. Of course, it's private property where the burial ground is. But we finally linked up with the Hartford division of the Ancient Order of Hibernians,
Mhm.
and they were great. They really reached out and embraced this project, and they started a fundraiser, and they very successful in a pretty short period of time. They raised enough money to put a big, beautiful memorial to the canal workers, to all the canal workers,
Mhm.
but it mentions some who may not have survived their time there. In the meantime, we mentioned we developed that Montgomery Mill into apartments. So the canal property just north of it,
Mhm.
um, they well, part of the deal we made over the tax increment financing package
Mhm.
was that they would give this land to the town to put a park there. So we have a lower canal picnic area.
Oh,
So if you
nice.
walk the canal coming south, you can stay there, have a picnic, or you can start there. There's a little parking, and you use that as your base point for your hike or your bike ride. And so it's in that park is where this beautiful canal memorial was
They can really
erected.
appreciate firsthand all the hard
It's
work that went
great.
into that. Yeah.
And so many good compliments from people who are visiting, and because they can learn a little bit about the history. And so this year it's on March 23rd. Each year around St. Patrick's Day, we do a sort of rededication
Yeah.
ceremony. And the way we kind of formalize it, we wear the top hats and the formal garb. And
Mhm.
the idea is that we're giving these laborers the respect that they deserved all along but didn't get.
Mhm.
But better late
Make it
than
up for
never.
lost time.
Yeah,
Totally.
make it up for lost time. And it's been we get a good crowd. Uh, uh, Representative Larson has been particularly supportive of that annual event.
Mhm.
Senator Blumenthal has been there once or twice over the last few years. So it gets out. And it also gives the town an opportunity to celebrate this unique heritage
Yeah.
that it has. Not every town was the site of 400 Irish immigrant laborers coming and living there for 2 years.
Yeah.
So we have this heritage. We should celebrate it.
It was a technological innovation at the time too. It was a big deal.
It was cutting edge. It
Yeah,
was
that was
cutting
being
edge.
Silicon Valley at the time. It was, definitely. What was most surprising to you in the research, especially from the point of view of, like, say, a first selectman? What was permitting different 100 years ago? How did they do
Uh,
public works sort of stuff?
yeah, it was so unique because I say Irish, but really they were Irish Catholic. That
Mhm.
was that was unique in Connecticut.
Mhm.
Our local historian, who kind of wrote the book of Windsor Locks history, Jabez Haskell-Hayden, he died in around 1890. He wrote in the latter part of the 1800s. He talked about the Irish laborers arriving,
Mhm.
and he said they were Irish Catholic, and he said I had seen but one before. And he was a man, and he had, like the arrival of an Irish Catholic was so weird to
Might
the
as well
area.
have been an alien, yeah.
It might as well have been an alien. So that really surprised me because suddenly I realized this cultural divide that
Mhm.
existed, and they didn't blend. They didn't like move into their houses or rent house. They lived in a little shanty town that was built up for their purposes, right along the side of the canal.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
That was interesting, but then I realized that these were still fairly devout people, but they had no way to have their religious needs tended to. Um, Technically, they were in the Archdiocese of Boston, which
Mhm.
included all of New England at the time,
Yeah.
but they didn't know that. They had come from New York. So early on in construction, one of them was seriously injured. And as people want in those circumstances, he wanted the last rites administered.
Yeah.
Where are they going to find a priest to administer the last rites? So two guys volunteered, and they went to Hartford, and they got on a steamboat. The steamboat service was available to Hartford. They took the boat back to New York, and they convinced the priest to come up, and he did.
Wow.
And he came up, Reverend John Power, who is, interestingly enough, was the Vicar General of the Archdiocese of New York, but it's Trinity Church was the base of it. And that's the church when the Twin Towers came down.
Hmm.
They had on the fence, they had all these signs. It was in
Yeah,
the
way
news.
downtown there. Yeah.
That's where he was from. And he came all the way up by steamboat and he ministered last rites. And while he was there, he tended to the other spiritual needs of these workers.
Yeah.
Eventually, Boston got an extra priest. They another priest from was converted, I think, and he was assigned to the Archdiocese of Boston. They got it together, and he would get on a horse and he would drive the circuit. He would go to
You just
any
kind of go
hospital
around
and tend to the needs. So I heard that his baptismal records survived, and they were in the archives of the
okay.
Archdiocese of Boston. So off I went, and I requested this. And if you've ever been to an archives, there's an archivist who's about 120 years old, and he comes out and he walks out and he comes walking out with this little leather-bound book.
Yeah.
This is it. I start flipping through, and I see Stonington, Pawcatuck, New London, and then I see this little entry in his own hand on the canals above Hartford. And during his
Doesn't
first
even have a
trip,
name for
yeah.
the place. Yeah.
So over the 2 years of construction, Father Woodley made the stop on his circuit 3 times and performed 15 baptisms. So from each one of those records, I get, well, the child's name,
Yeah.
I get a mother, a father, a sponsor, and a sponsor. So I went from a couple of names I knew from the cemetery in Suffield, 60, well, actually 59 names of adult laborers. The reason it was an odd number is because on one of the entries, it had the child's name, that's the mother's name, and where it would have the father's name in big block letters was written illegitimate.
Oh.
So I only got 59 out of that source. But that was a huge discovery. But again, it made me realize that they basically were fish out of water. They had no way to deal with their own culture, their religious needs, because it was all developing right there.
Yeah.
Hartford had a handful of Catholic families at the time. I mean, maybe 4 or 5 Catholic families. So it was all just evolving. But from that,
Yeah.
then the canals and then the mills come in and Irish workers come to the mills and then Italian workers and Polish workers. And suddenly you have this whole cultural shift that takes place in Connecticut and in many other places around the country that started with the canal movement.
Yeah, that's interesting. The canals led into the whole industrial thing, and by the end of that, cities in Connecticut are full of brick factories making everything. It's pretty wild.
Connecticut was on the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution, and the canal was an example of that because they were ambitious. They're like, let's, New Haven, let's get a canal. Let's rival the Erie Canal. Let's do something like that.
Yeah, that didn't seem like a far-fetched dream to say we're gonna go toe-to-toe with Boston and New York and whatever at that time.
It was pretty bold and ambitious. It really was. Something to be proud of, in my opinion.
You talk about going to some of these archives and stuff. Is most of this research when you're doing this sort of stuff still going places and looking at old books? Like, is this stuff that is not online anywhere?
Yes.
Right.
Getting
I
better.
think some of it, so you see like, oh, I want to know something, Google, but these things
it's
haven't
getting better.
Yet.
Those records from Father Woodley's leather-bound in the last year, they're now available through Ancestry.com.
Oh, that's cool.
I was surprised to see it because, this is 15 years ago when I found them or whatever, somewhere around there. So every day it gets better. But another big source of records was at Cornell. I went up to the archives at Cornell. Again, there was finding aids online. Like here you can find records, and there was the repository of Canvas White, the chief engineer's personal files. So I went up there.
Started up at Erie and came down.
Yep. And I said, do you have anything on the Enfield Falls Canal or the Windsor Locks Canal? So he pulled out the box and opened it and flipped through. There was one folder, the Enfield Falls Canal. And that had his drawings. Like, how are we going to build these locks? He had sketched out in pencil.
Here's how we're going to do it. Yeah.
It's all there. And then he also had the names of some contractors, like the masonry contractor who built the the three locks, or the four locks, and the head gate was a fellow, believe it or not, Mason Barker, who had worked with him on the
How
Erie Canal.
appropriate.
Yeah, Mason meant his
Where
name.
did the stone come from?
Where did the what?
The stone
Oh,
for
the
the
stone.
yeah.
Yeah, it was multiple sources.
Is it like Portland
They
brownstone
kept
or
getting it was uh granite, and they
okay?
kept getting contractors saying they could deliver and then not delivering, and that delayed
Hmm.
the project. They ended up drawing some from local sources, like
Hmm.
they created some quarries
Hmm.
for the stone. Some must have come up the river. I'm still not 100% sure where. Although we do know the lumber came
Hmm.
from Bath, New Hampshire, not Bath, Maine, Bath, New Hampshire, which is on the river
And they just
because we
floated
have
it
the
all right
tide
down.
history, right? Because a lot of the canal, in the Windsor Locks part of the canal, they dug it out of excavated it from existing land.
Hmm.
But in the Suffield end, what they did is that what is the west bank of the river was the west bank of the river became the west bank of the canal,
Hmm.
and then they constructed a levee that ran parallel to the bank in the water to create this channel. And
Okay.
then they would blast material out from the west side and throw it into these cribs, these giant cribs that they built out of these timbers from Bath, New Hampshire. And that would
Hmm.
sink them in place. And then they went all the way down.
Really kind of
And
a
so again,
genius use of
there
what
was
you had there. Yeah.
a lumberman by the name of Carlton who supplied most of that wood and floated it down in rafts from New Hampshire. So we do know the source of most of the wood. The stone, we have some sources, but I still think I still think I'm missing one. There must be one large
Was it
place.
kind of a patchwork of what they could find as they went along?
Yeah, it got a little touch and go because no one could come through with what they promised. Uh, and we have Mason Barker's letters to Canvas White saying, "Look, I'm having trouble here. The guy that we made a deal with, he let us down in no uncertain terms,
Yeah.
and we got to come up with another one." So I found those records.
Yeah, that is
I
great that you
found
could
those
like
letters.
firsthand from the people who were actually doing it, like
Right.
their
So
words. Yeah.
firsthand, primary sources, and which is probably why it took me 22 years, but or at least one of the reasons. But knowing that this stuff, when I went in, I didn't even know this stuff existed.
Yeah.
Had it all been lost to history? But little by little, I over the years, I'd go a long time with not much, and then I'd
And
have
would
a
you
big
say
discovery.
that your book is one of the first time that kind of all these sources of information have kind of been brought together into one sort of cohesive document?
Well, yeah, what on the 100th anniversary of the canal,
Hmm.
actually, it was the 100th anniversary of the Connecticut River Company built the canal, but their financing arm was the Connecticut River Banking Company,
Hmm.
which actually turned into Society for Savings over the years. But on their 100th anniversary, there was a history of the bank written, and that contained some
Hmm.
pretty good stuff about the canal, but none of it had to do with the laborers, other than mentioning they were Irish laborers.
So it
Um,
was it was the history of
yeah,
the canal from the bank standpoint, sort of thing.
right. And
Yeah.
it was the planners, it was the industrialists who financed the
The
canal. They
money, the
all do their rightful place in history. But I kept thinking, yeah, but there's another side
there's another piece of this
here
picture that we're missing.
that no
Yeah.
one's ever talked about. So this book talks about that. And it's not like I try and pull it back so all the glory goes to the Irish laborers.
Yeah.
But what I do conclude is that between the Irish laborers, the Hartford and industrialists, and these young civil engineers who
Mhm.
basically developed this out of nothing, figured it out. All three of them had to come together. They all needed each other for this to
Yeah.
work. And that's really sort of my concluding point in the book.
If someone wanted to learn more about this, read your book, how could they find out more about it?
Well, there's a couple sources. Obviously, my book is available on Amazon,
Okay.
Barnes and Noble. You just type in Windsor Locks Canal or Kervick, my last name. It'll come up on a Google search.
Okay.
And sales have actually been pretty good, maybe a little bit even better than I expected,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of interest in this.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing you can do, obviously, and I certainly would appreciate it if you do. You can come to our annual Canal Memorial. Like I said, this year it's at 1 o'clock on a Sunday, right in the Lower Canal picnic area,
Hmm.
and that's on March 23rd. Um, There are books about the canal. Well, the Connecticut River Banking Company is the one I mentioned, the 100th anniversary.
Hmm.
It's very good. Um, but you can also come walk the trail. That's probably the best way, really, because I always really enjoyed the trail because to me, it's this beautiful combination of industry and nature
Mm.
where they coexist in a great way. I mean, we got bald eagles along the trail,
Yeah.
but then also you've got a cut ledge that you can see was cut by man to function in the canal or or bridges or an
Mm.
aqueduct. At one point, the canal had to pass Stony Brook and Suffield.
Yeah.
How do you get past the brook? It's a bridge that carries water over a brook. That's
Yeah.
still there. It's amazing. And so you walk the canal trail. That might be the best way to get a
Yeah.
feel for how
From just
wonderful
out of
it is.
curiosity, from the trail, can you walk easily into like town anywhere?
Yeah, well, yeah, the trail starts in Windsor Locks, right? You've got downtown,
Right in
the
downtown.
train
So like if you
station,
wanted to get some lunch
and
or something, if you were going to go for a walk one
yeah,
day,
it's
there's
right there. And
okay.
Suffield's maybe a mile away from the real center of town, but
Mm.
not far away. And they've got some great shops and
And
eateries
you
and
would get
stuff
to that by walking down
as
the trail
well.
as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so you can
Or
make a nice afternoon out of it or something.
yeah, or bring a picnic lunch and sit there and enjoy it. It's very it's always been well used, but I don't know if you recall, but I was in office when the pandemic broke out,
Hmm.
made my time in office even more challenging than I expected. Um, but there was a real push to get outside because everyone felt so cooped up. So
Hmm.
public spaces had a real um, there was a real effort because you could get out on the trail, but you could keep a reasonable distance from other people on the trail
Yeah.
and get some fresh air. So usership skyrocketed during
Yeah.
COVID, and it
And there
really
was
has
also
been
some
now.
grants going around at that time too, the ARPA fund kind of stuff that
Yes,
people were trying to
yeah,
turn into
yeah.
things for outdoor public use.
It was a success story, and it really helped a lot of people. I hope get through it. Matter of fact, and DEE, uh, uh, Energy and Environmental DEP. Um, we normally don't open until May 1,
Hmm.
close at the end of November. We luckily we were having one of those years, a pretty good spring, so I convinced them to open it about a month and a half early, just so
Yeah.
people could get out and use it. And they agreed, and they did. I'm sure it was probably not easy for them to do to change that routine, but they did
Hmm.
it, and everyone was very well appreciated. So the
Yeah.
usership is strong right
Is
now.
there do
People
people
fish too.
volunteer to work on the canal? Is there like a group that they
Yes,
can
there's an
volunteer with?
outstanding group called the Friends of the Canal, or the Friends of the
Yeah.
Canal at Enfield Falls. All volunteer. They get some limited funding from
Hmm.
DEP, and they apply for independent grants, but they maintain um, the grass and growth on either side of the canal. You remember, even though there were boats being pulled by steam
Hmm.
um, tugs through the canal, there was still occasion where horses and mules were
Yeah.
used. So there couldn't be any growth between the canal and the towpath because the ropes would get tangled up in that. So
Mm.
historically, that's always been um, clear and
Yeah.
gives you a nice view of the water as you're walking along. You can see turtles and otters, but that had all become overgrown,
Hmm.
and it really was starting to impact the overall experience. And the Friends of the Enfield Canal just methodically went about one section at a time, just the way the canal was built,
Hmm.
cleared that section, and then they maintain it. So now it's the pretty much 100% of the canal bank is clear of growth and debris. So you get this nice grassy bank, and you can really, as you're walking along, it's right there. So
Awesome.
it's nice. They do a great job, a
Yeah.
great job.
Well,
We
Chris,
can
it's
always
been
use
great
more
talking to
people.
you about Windsor Locks today.
Thanks. I'm
The
glad I
history
let you get a
and
word
your
in
book sounds
edgewise.
really cool. It's fun to see someone who's so passionate about their hometown and the history of it, you know?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't let you get a word in.
No, no,
Once
no.
I get going,
It's
as
been
you can
great. It's
see,
like I said, see someone who's passionate about their hometown, you know?
once
Write
I
a book
get
about it, be
going,
the first selectman. You gotta love where you're from.
I love my hometown. Yeah, I'm a Windsor Locks guy. I mean, I live in New London now, but I'm a Windsor Locks guy. It's always going to be,
Oh,
who I am.
yeah.
Yeah.
We'd like to thank our guest, Chris Kervick. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Joe Thornton is our executive producer. Christopher Gilson is our producer. Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.